Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. Oh, by the way, we're well into our 70th series of shows, and that's largely down to you folks for watching and listening and sending us your comments. Very much appreciated. Thank you. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. I know I say this every week, but here you are. Here's another classic for you. Mainstream news clips carry footage of Boris Johnson being roundly humiliated in his meeting with President Biden. Afterwards, his spokesman said, I kid you not, US-UK relations are as good as they have been in decades. Well, they must have been pretty awful before, that's all I can say. And also, it was a clear illustration, perhaps, of the classic British mistake of assuming that senior US politicians are uninterested in Northern Ireland. They are. I've been there. They're not only not uninterested, they're deeply and profoundly interested. And anyone who seeks to underestimate the power of the Irish lobby in the United States is making a very, very big mistake. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight, we are talking to marketing expert, Professor Iain Black. We'll be discussing his new concept of Voices for Scotland and so much more besides. You're really going to find this both, I hope, educational as well as entertaining. And he's taking your questions live. So details on how to submit your questions, as ever, are on the What's On guide at whatson.scot. TNT, as I say every week, stands for The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. Furthermore, we're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Now to our guest tonight, The Nation Talks to Iain Black. How are you, Iain? How has COVID and the pandemic affected you?
Hi, John. Thank you very much for having me on here. COVID, well, I was on the train up to Stirling for only the second time, Stirling University, on Monday there. And I was looking out the window there, the amazing scenes as you go north. And I was just realizing how small in many ways my life had become around COVID. And just think, wow, isn't it beautiful to see the changing scenery, to see the sheep, to see all of these things that had become unusual for the life I live in North Edinburgh, and have become, much more acquainted with every nook and cranny of the square mile around me, which in its own way is great. COVID has, I think, affected me in the same ways as many people. It's sort of a small life. My family have mainly avoided it, though my wife, despite being double jabbed, did succumb recently. But there was bigger issues on family around. I've not seen my parents for 18 months. They live abroad and have not been over. My brother, who lives in England, he struggled to make it up as well. I've not seen my nieces now for 3 years. So all of these, we were going to see some cousins a couple of weeks ago, but COVID got in the way of that. So there's those things that have made my life smaller. I mean, in physically and emotionally, I think as well.
Yeah. Do you feel you were beginning to see the end of it? What's your sense?
Well, I'd like to say yes, but I think we're endemic now. I think we now have a situation where we have colds, flus, and COVID, and that these will be present in our society ongoing. And we, as we previously, we dealt with a cold and we put our head down and we went to work. And if it was the flu and it was the real flu, then we didn't go to work because we were in real difficulty. And now with COVID, we've got another step up from there. So I think this the notions of building back better, getting past all this, I think we've now got it's endemic, and we will be managed by the booster vaccines and public health machinations as through time. But so I'd like to, I think we're past the novelty. I think we're now into the understanding we're living with this now.
Now, you're a professor. How has it affected the students that you work with?
Well, I think that I'm profoundly worried at the end. When geez, it seems so long ago now. We looked to see when it started, and as it was coming at essentially the end of the academic year in 2020. So all those honours students that we were having real concerns over everything, having to change everything, change the lectures, and then the way that they did assessments. I think there was then a false idea that we would, reasonable at the time, but proven to be false, that things would go back to normal quite quickly. And the 2021 master's students and honours students had to deal with the same things. So we have the academic and administrative staff worked incredibly hard to try and pivot onto online, but the online experience is nowhere near as good as a lecture room where we have, the collaborative learning, and particularly as we're seeing with the digital poverty around that, we have assumed that we can use Teams and breakout rooms and Padlet and all sorts of other things, but actually I've had a number of calls with an African student from her toilet because it was the only place that she could get peace from her family, on her phone, trying to understand some complex topics. And there's there's been sort of a profoundly difficult, but we are hugely adaptable, and people have tried. But I'm starting teaching live face to face, 9 o'clock on a Monday. Always a good lecture slot in a couple of weeks' time, and I cannot wait.
Good, that's good. It must be a particular challenge because your specialisation, I guess, is sustainability and climate change. I'm just trying to think of somebody in the toilet trying to deal with an issue as complex as that.
Well, but as you rightly introduced me, my core discipline is marketing, but I don't. My job is not to try and help people to sell more plastic stuff. It is to use the knowledge and frameworks of persuasion and creation of value to create value in different ways of living, and the enjoyment of not buying. For example. So what I'm doing oftentimes, and this was a master's student, is telling them something that they think is the opposite of what the subject was about. And they're fascinated by it and dig in, but not particularly easy for them to say, maybe you came along here thinking I was going to teach you how to make lots of money from selling stuff. That's not what I'm going to try and do here, because we've got the planet's on fire, and we need to.
I mean, you're doing some exciting work in persuading people not to consume. And you're right. I mean, most of marketing is predicated upon how can I shift more tins of Heinz beans. You seem to be in exactly the opposite sector, which is to say, do you really need all these tins of Heinz beans, perhaps?
So the American Marketing Association, maybe 10 years ago now, changed its definition of marketing, which was very much away from that commercial for-profit, let's shift stuff, to value creation. So that allows for us to understand, develop plans, and then create value. And that value can be, we're going to sell you a tin of beans because that's valuable to you at lunchtime because when you're hungry. But it is also an idea. This is why the importance of marketing within campaigning. The notion of using essentially the same techniques to sell you on an idea of voting for independence, voting for Brexit. All of these examples. It's the same basic processes. What I try to bring in here is through wonderful colleagues like Catherine Trebek in the Wellbeing Economy, a different goal of what we're trying to achieve. So and then by setting out different goals, we can construct different ways of trying to persuade people that actually taking your time is a great way of consuming differently. Instead of just taking a journey to get from point A to point B, let's go back to the idea of enjoying the journey. Let's enjoy not being saddled with those goods that need then to be looked after. Anybody who's got a back lawn or a front lawn knows that you are working for your good, for your goods here, and you're spending your precious time. So there's lots of really quite resonant ways that we can talk about trying to get people to consume less, because the very clear indication, very clear lesson is that it is our level of consumption and overconsumption that's destroying the planet, and a growth-based economy is the one thing that we have to change to have a chance of then achieving a sustainable development.
I mean, that makes so much sense, but when I look around, I think most people would probably agree that you see almost exactly the opposite happening, i.e. that consumerism is writ large. And I mean, I have a personal anecdote here. One of our first clients when I set up our first company called Communication Works was Anita Roddick.
Okay.
And Anita was the only person I know who invited to a marketing conference, stood up in front of 1,000 people and said, marketing is crap, and sat down again. She said, now I'll take your questions. But ironically, when I spoke with her, it was consumerism she felt was crap. It wasn't marketing. Now, marketing got our headlines, no question about that, because, in a way that consumerism wouldn't have done. There's no question that that was the case, because so many people left the conference saying, well, I felt really bad about that. But she was making a real point in very difficult circumstances, because nobody was talking about consumerism then. Nobody to speak of.
So we have a huge structural issue around here. And as you're saying, you go into any supermarket that's there that may have declared that it's going to be net zero by 2050, 2030 or whenever, and it's still stacked on every shelf with plastic. I think I know Brexit's trying to do it maybe in a different way to see what the shelves would look like when they're empty. But if we were to go in there and just take all the things that were wrapped in plastic off the shelves, Asda's not going to have very much to look at. But that's a structural issue, and it's a structural issue caused by the rules of the game the system that we live in, and that's a growth-based and exploitative, a growth-based economy, and it's where the Scottish government's activities or approaches to sustainability are going to fall foul, in that you cannot have a growth-based economy and achieve our sustainability, our climate change promises. They've tried to finesse it by saying, okay, but we can have some sustainable growth, and we can have inclusive growth. The bigger brains, much bigger brains than mine, have spent much longer careers working this through, and there is no way of marrying the two. Yeah. So the consumerism that we see is just is us being forced into the system. Forced to make choices that way.
I would agree. And some of the choices are made before we get a chance to make our choices. I mean, I go and buy fruit. It's covered in plastic. It's up to its gazoo in plastic. I go and buy fruit overseas in Southern Europe. It isn't covered in plastic. And we ended up there, I guess, at least in part, because somebody worked out a business model that said, we can keep this stuff fresher for longer, or at least it may be taste-free, but it's still consumable. And you think, well, that's a wrong choice. Maybe we owe a service to our farmers to put fresh stuff on supermarkets. But if you're locked into a model that says, which I think is not unusual, you produce a packet of biscuits in South Edinburgh and ship them to Milton Keynes and then ship them back up to North Edinburgh, which increasingly makes no sense, absolutely no sense whatsoever. But that's the supermarket model. And maybe that's one of the things that has to change.
There's so much of what you said in there is reminding me of an example of Oakley cheddar that wanted to put Oakley on cheddar into the local Safeways as it was. And the only way they could manage to do it was to send it down onto the mainland, into England, onto a truck to come back again, yes, to go onto the shelves. They say the system just doesn't allow a bloke, someone in a van to turn up and say, "Here's your cheddar." So we have deep-seated structural issues, but we also, the other side of it, we have a very clear idea now what we need to do to solve it. COVID has given us an insight into the types of government, the type of muscular government that works when you have a threat that is taken seriously enough, and you have you have society and individuals convinced of that and giving the government permission to act. Look how deep they were able to act in a very short period of time. Now, the climate crisis is much worse than the COVID crisis, though obviously characteristics of the COVID crisis make it easier for governments to act quickly. But COVID taught us, and we shouldn't let the governments forget about this, that they can act, and they can act deep, and they can change the functioning of our society very quickly. If they so wish. And it also, for those, and I know this is not the experience for many people, particularly those already living in poverty, but for many of us, it allowed us to reconnect with our local areas, reconnect with our shops. And when our local high street is no longer made up of these kind of monoculture places they've all gone out of business, is it? Where, there was the same shops in every high street. When it's now down to those local places selling local things you can't buy on Amazon, then you get a vibrant local community, local high street building back up again, and we can start to create some space where you can go and buy those apples that are grown locally, etc. But it does take us to recognise that the crisis is here, and to not let the government step and to force the government to act against the system, not to tinker with the system.
I think that's a very good point. And if COVID has done one positive thing, it's probably around that. It has awakened people to the whole concept that there's a point to government. Because when you get a government like we have right now, in Westminster, which is predicated upon, let's say, unethical behaviour in many respects, it erodes people's trust in government. And what COVID has done, is to help restore some notion of confidence in politicians sort of pointing in roughly the same direction and acting, not talking, but acting. Do you think that the COP26 that's coming up soon in Glasgow is going to make much of a difference? Or do you think it'll just revolve into another talking shop?
So I've been at a couple of the intersessionals. I was at one of the Bonn intersessionals, which is the kind of intervening talks, and they are pretty dispiriting. The best way to describe them is like the really bad Star Wars films, when they had the Galactic Senate all talking about some sort of minor issue and getting to no point that allowed Palpatine to come and sort of take over. And you just think, like, there is no solution in here when a sentence that is put down by the Irish is then attacked by another country because it's being sponsored by a third party, because it doesn't trust what the Irish are doing, because it thinks of their geopolitical combinations. And then you think, well, that was perfectly sensible what the Irish were asking for. And why so when you look at it, you're deeply worried about whether things can come from it. I think there is sufficient momentum now that we will continue to see change, and continue to see the promises made. The difficulty is we are now past the point of promises, where promises matter. There's no medals here for trying. We have to get carbon out the air, or methane, but let's concentrate. We have to get that out. And if we fail on that, it's no point coming out and say, hey, we had really good targets and we meant to do it, because we're already at 1.5 degrees, nearly 1.5 degrees warming on land. It's when you bring the oceans into it, where we're just over 1 degree. So we have to have effective action quickly, and that's where I think we'll get a shift. We'll get a useful shift, but the action at the depth that's required, at the speed that's required, I'm not sure at. And if you don't mind, there's kind of one version that the Sustainable Development Community, of which I'm part. I'm a theme leader at the International Sustainable Development Research Society, and we kind of call it the Pearl Harbor moment. that we are quite sure that the world can and will change, but it'll only happen when there is a catastrophe. So in terms of, the American, the way that the American industrial might turned on a dime after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, if New York is lost to a tsunami, if when something predictable but unexpected happens, the light will go on and everything will come into it. But we're at that point where we'll be too late for to put the genie back in the bottle. So maybe I'm still. We have the answers. We've got we've got real growing awareness and knowledge about this. We need to ensure that the governments act fast, but that action must not, this is a real worry, further embed the existing power structures, as we're seeing with the oil and gas industry, all of a sudden becoming the partners for net zero. Their role is to make sure that the capitalization based on the amount of oil and gas that they have is to make sure that they continue to pump all of that oil and gas out the ground. That's what because that's what their companies are based on. So that they will say and do anything to allow that to happen. And the difficulty with it is they're really good at persuading you. They're brilliantly, they've got such great PR machines. And I think the only way of making sure that you don't persuade them is don't speak to them.
Well, that sounds plausible, but let me just posit this thought. The reason they do that is because of us. In other words, we want cars to run cheaply. Furthermore, and this is the fundamental point which we really have to tackle somewhere on the line, we all have insurance policies. We all have pensions. Much of those funds are invested in carbon companies, i.e., when we talk about the oil majors, for example, there's lots of funds invested in Exxon and BP and others. Where do these funds come from? Well, they come from you and me. So you could argue that to some extent, we are all responsible if we have pensions, insurance policies, whatever. It's one of the fundamental flaws in the system. I wrote a book on business ethics, God knows how many years ago now, and I tried to deal with this and say, these huge corporations are creatures of us. We created them and we keep them in existence. So how would you deal with that? Is there a way? First of all, do you accept that notion?
There's a couple of things in there I would maybe challenge. The first one is this notion of products, that we want products, that we want a car, and I think this is also a fundamental issue that the next IPCC report is going to deal with, is that people don't want products; they want the services the products deliver. So really, the biggest lesson we can be drawing at the moment with the gas crisis that they're going on is that people do not want heating. They want to be warm. They want to have warm, comfortable homes where they can entertain. They can come in after a hard day's work, or do a hard day's work as it is now. We just happen to have this product solution for that at the moment, which fits existing power structures, rather than insulating the hell out of the country. And I know, Extinction Rebellion made that point in their own particular way last week. So I think we've got to be careful that people, a car delivers flexibility, it delivers status, it delivers transport and things. There are other solutions to these things than spending a significant amount of money, taking on a significant amount of debt in order to do it. So I think I would challenge, and that's something that we also need to continually come back to. It's that the product is not it just delivers a solution to it. The other thing about blame's a difficult one in here, and I think I'm on pensions. I have one in Australia, whereas I worked for 8 years at the University of Sydney. And I ticked the sustainable, as you would hope, the sustainable version. And then when I dug down below the top 20 types of 20 businesses that they were investing in, James Hardie Industries came up, and this is if anyone wants to depress themselves even further, go and have a look to see what James Hardie Industry did to asbestos victims in Australia. You know, as a business ethics expert, I'm sure you'll know that case. So we having the power to make the changes is difficult. I think there is a really powerful divestment campaign going on. Friends of the Earth Scotland are doing some terrific work around that recently. Put a lot of pressure, unsuccessfully, unfortunately, on Strathclyde, which has got I think my figures right here. For dint of history, they've got about 25 billion under control at Strathclyde, and they didn't get the divestment commitments they wanted to. But on the other hand, you had Susan Aitken, who got a big vision about what Glasgow wanted, and then said, but we'll have to bring in private money to pay for it. No, you've got 25 billion of pension money there, that a section of that through patient capital can then to provide the goods and services that the people of Glasgow need. So I think, yes, we can blame us, but it's bound, as you talked earlier, we are part of an infrastructure that makes it really difficult to buy non-plastic wrapped food, and only folk with deep pockets are able to do that. That is not a choice we're making. That is a choice that's made for us, our role is that power and rebellion against it at the ballot box, but also on the streets, and demanding of our political parties. I think that was the point I was trying to make, is that we are far from being powerless as individuals. I think that was the point. And when I say this, I have to condition it. There's loads of people watching and listening who will be saying, well, this is all very well and good. It all sounds terribly middle class and pucker. But the fact of the matter is, I'm on UC, my benefits are being cut, the heating costs are going up. What the heck am I supposed to do? I've got to feed my kids. If I had the resources that you guys have, then certainly I would be considering all this disinvestment and the rest of it. I just can't, literally can't. I can scarcely get by from week to week. What do you say to these people? No, absolutely right. Absolutely, I agree with you. And the solution is not £20 more in universal credit. You know, the solution is at an institutional infrastructure view that creates so that the social housing that's available is, on one hand, it is social housing of high quality that people are comfortable in living in, where heating isn't is no longer, direct heating is no longer required. We've got to question the headline figures in Scotland around the 100,000 new homes that are built. Well, you might have built 100,000 houses, but how many communities did you build?
Yeah.
How many workable communities with that the people could participate? How many were built to the standards where you don't need heating? So I think the person who making those points is spot on, and where we have to push is for the structural changes around, and go back onto old hobby horses here that we're still trying to ride of land ownership, but also very much about local government, instead of local government's role being to provide for people, do things for people. Local government's role should be to help people do themselves and not get in the way. So that localization, one of the benefits of localizing local government is that it becomes responsive to what people need, rather than trying to do things for them, and therefore conditioning them into some forms of helplessness.
Yeah, very good point. I'd like to move us on. We might come back to that depending on the questions and whether we've got enough time, because I suspect you probably feel we've just scratched the surface. But I would like to move on, if you don't mind. And I'd like to use a question from Suzanne Campbell-Creighton to do that. And maybe we can then perhaps talk about Voices for Scotland. She says, how do we engage with no voters in an emotional way? It's easy to bombard them with facts, but how do we pull at the heartstrings?
So I think that's a terrifically important question, and I think if we stepping slightly out to the side of that at the moment, we've had If we look over the recent history of the independence campaign, what we did so terrifically well last time round was have those individual conversations with people that we knew and in many cases loved, that were able to give them the confidence and support to help them in this tricky decision. I think also what the question talks about is that we use different forms of information to make decisions, and one of the kind of narratives around is that we make rational decisions, and we always like to try and make rational decisions, and that's just not the case. We have two information processing systems, two hardwired information processing systems in our brains, and the first one is emotional and fast and reactive, because when you hear a noise, when you see something new, you better be able to make a quick decision about whether it's dangerous. And that's why fear is also always the most powerful influence. So we have to, I think, for the independence campaign, we have to accept the role of facts and figures as supportive of the type of decision that that we're asking now quite a narrow group of people to make. Okay, there's 35-40% of people who would vote yes. In fact, maybe 35% would happily give a hand, an arm, or an eye in order for independence, not just a case of going to the ballot box. And they probably, maybe the others, there's 25% of folk on the other side there. But even in the middle, we've got a much smaller group who are looking at this risky decision. We obviously think we've got all the talents that required to mitigate that risk. But if they feel it's risky, then we've got to try and mitigate that risk. And we mitigate that risk through building confidence by giving social by role models. Well, someone like me believes it, and they've got the same life as me and the same concerns as me. Well, that gives me some confidence that they're doing. So I think if we think go to how we bring that at a campaign level, we have to put peer-to-peer campaigning at the heart of what we do, and that's a long-term escapade. It's not an individual sets of activities, it's a long-term process.
Explain what peer-to-peer means.
Peer-to-peer, sorry, just very simply speaking to people like you. So the most effective, and we see this in sales, and we see this in persuasion of all sort of what we would describe as high involvement, risky decisions, is that the person that you're most likely to be persuaded by is someone like you, around about the same age, around about the same background as you. So that's your, so our people who are, and we in Voices for Scotland, we very deliberately avoid using yes and no, because we don't want to go into old identities. But we say that so our voice is speaking to those people who are indie curious or undecided, that matching those people to each other at a hyper local level is the way to first of all to use the most powerful persuasive techniques and to support people to change their mind, but also really importantly for a strategy avoids and negates what they're very good at. The powerful ownership of the media, the big budgets that they're going to have, the social media targeting that they're able to do. If we built a peer-to-peer relationship between people who are like each other over a period of time where you were just describing your experiences of the referendum last time round, when that next shell comes across from the new Better Together, or from the whichever news outlet, you're able to speak to them, understand what the work through the complexities, but ultimately build people's confidence in themselves. So we did some research when we were developing Voices for Scotland, and what was essentially the difference between people who voted who supported independence and those who weren't? Because if you go to demographics, people will say, well, I know plenty of pensioners for yes, but I know many. So it's not just about demographics; it's what lies underneath there. And what we found was that there was kind of three main indicators. That independent supporters are are still risk averse, but they're more willing to take a risk, and that's just a well documented individual differences. That some people are a bit daft with risk and charge on without thinking. We're not like that. We're still canny, but they know that the supporters of the union are a lot more risk averse. An independent supporter has more personal efficacy. So they think through their life experience that they're better at solving problems that life throws at them. So there's something about, well, if we've got a challenge, yeah, okay, I can deal with challenges. I've done it before. I've got that confidence in me. And the third thing that we're better is that we believe that we can deal with collective challenges better. So that's perceived collective efficacy around this. So those are the three kind of as well as identity. Are you British? Are you Scottish? The fundamental sort of psychological variables that explain your support. So therefore, to build your feelings of efficacy and about us and reduce risk, facts and figures can help, but they support. But it takes conversations.
Yeah,
it takes to dig into the nub of why they don't feel what the concern over the currency we'll use, even though everybody else has got a currency. What is it about us and currency that becomes difficult?
Yeah, it's interesting. I read a book by Tip O'Neill, who I think he was a speaker in the House in the United States, and he was a big, brash Boston politician. But even though he was fantastic at machine politics, his book was called All Politics is Local, which makes the point eloquently, I think. So tell us a little bit more about Voices for Scotland. How does it work? What do you, if there's peer-to-peer discussions, as you say, what part does Voices for Scotland play in that process?
So I think I'll answer maybe into two parts. So Voices, we've been emerged out of the Scottish Independence Convention a couple of years ago with a fundraiser, where we made some very deliberate and difficult choices about what we're doing. And the first one of those, from research-driven, from what the work we did first up, is that we had to avoid using yes and no, because that put people into camps and reinforced identities. And whereas absolutely appropriate for us to I'm still a member and very proud to be a member of Yes Edinburgh, North and Leith. But when we're campaigning, that's not necessarily the name that we should use. It's a bit like Alphabet and Google. Alphabet can still be yes, we can still be the holding company. But when we're speaking to the public, then we needed a different name. We needed it to be very inclusive and not shouty, because there was that concern about the facts being thrown at people. So we made these decisions. We wanted to we very clear about the colours that we use, the fact that it's called Voices, the fact that we'll talk about the indie curious. So we constructed this view where we would this campaign that would be about building peer-to-peer connections. The last 2 years have been somewhat strange and difficult for a number of reasons to be able to do that, particularly the last 18 months where online has come. So we've the fantastic team that we have did a lot of deep campaigning, but not particularly broad. I think it's one of the things that we didn't get particularly right, is the breadth of awareness of what we did. But the people who came to our events, the people who did the conversation cafes, became really very loyal to the idea, because it talked to a different different type of campaigner than was maybe being provided by some of the other brands. What we're developing now, and this is where I think we're I'm trying to be very Scottish here, not blowing on trumpet, but we have an idea that is world leading in terms of the campaigning platform that we are currently developing, called Voices Connect. So Voices Connect is going to be a platform that facilitates campaigns over a campaign period. It's not just a website where you come once, but it allows us to, and here's the clues in the name, to connect to the undecided or indie curious in a way that puts them in charge of who they speak to. So I'm not going to give you the kind of exact details on that, because that's a bit of the reveal that we do, and when it comes to the launch. But we create a safe space for independent supporters or voices and undecided, who we can a number of ways, including street stalls, social media advertising, peer-to-peer work, bring them to the site and start a safe space for a conversation with the ideal that it soon moves out of the online space and becomes something like a walk, a coffee, a beer, or what, where you're actually building those relationships. What it also is going to do with Connect, and this is, I think, two really crucial things. It's data driven. That in all of the discussions that you're having between the two parties, we then between the group, there has to be some recording of what went on. So you and I have knocked many doors as canvassing, and we didn't record enough information. Certainly the SNP's version now doesn't record enough information. It goes, where are you on this scale? Thanks very much, and off you go. Instead of being able to pick out some of the things that were a concern for you. And so we, when was the meeting had? Who was it between? We know the data for those. We were able to then test different messages that come through. So we can have a system where, as part of these conversations, if someone is they've told us they're concerned about currency, and we've spoken to all our side, the internal voices. How should we deal with currency? What are the ways that we need to, the messages that work? What are the stories that work to persuade people? So we've done that before the campaign starts. When somebody then says, "Oh, I'm really worried about currency," we can test two different versions. We can get one person saying story A, and the other person gets story B, and we see which one works best. And then we refine things down. So Connect brings people together in a safe space to create those relationships, allows us to collect data and refine what we're doing, and also have essentially a library of activists as well who are able to help each other out. You don't know where someone who's got a graphic designer. You don't. Well, that gives a space to ask for someone to be a graphic designer. So that's what we're building towards. What we're not sure about at the moment is the right time to launch, because there's no point us launching it when the undecideds don't want to come and talk to us. And there will be a point in the campaigning cycle when they need to come to us, and that's the point we need to launch the system.
I mean, I would agree with that. You don't want to go. I don't know why we're getting interfered. You don't want to go too soon. You want to keep your powder dry, and you want to make an impact, because it's the old classic marketing thing. You have to hit it when the time is right. If you go too early, you go too late. You don't create the same impact. And maybe the currency question which you raised falls into the category that you mentioned earlier, which is that currency is a bit like selling features when you should really be selling benefits. I mean, nobody's terribly interested whether they're using a pound note or using a piece of monopoly money. As long as the shopkeeper takes the monopoly money, they could care less. I mean, the currency itself is, to that degree, is perhaps slightly immaterial. It's what can I do with that piece of paper? Right now, it happens to be a piece of paper. In previous centuries, it was a ducat or a groat or whatever, but it was a means to an end. It wasn't an end in itself. And one of the mistakes we probably made is to encourage people to think of it as an end instead of a means. So they hoard the stuff instead of, which makes no sense to anyone, quite frankly. But it's part of that mindset about, I've got the benefits and the features confused here. It's the currency one has obviously become iconic from last time round, and I know you're absolutely right. The ins and outs of banking theory, and as part of the SIC, we have a transitions paper series, and we've got some terrific work done on banking, on currency, and then the transition. Just looking at the nuts and bolts of how you then set up a currency. So I think we've probably won the argument that we need our own currency. So now, okay, what does it look like to set it up? So I think it's become iconic in that, have you really done the work?
rather than the specifics of it, and have you fully thought through the economic consequences. I think currency also brings us on to one of those three things that we need. It has to be a grassroots, peer-to-peer campaign based in every street. And I think there's three questions that, how local do you go? Where are you from? Oh, I'm from Scotland. Oh, that's interesting. Which part? Oh, I'm from Edinburgh. Oh, right. Oh, which part? Oh, I'm from Trinity. And then you might go down to, which part? And then Trinity Road. Well, I don't know if you give my way of address. Oops. But those are the things that are the meaningful geographic local. Go back to that point about all politics being local that we come down to. So what's required in my street and my area is different, but we still need unified answers on what are the borders going to look like, what's happening to Europe, and what about a currency? Because they've taken a life of, they're important questions, and they've taken a kind of iconic role within. So, and that's one of the difficulties, I think, that the movement and the SNP and the political parties have to come to an agreement on, that the answers to these cannot be imposed. It can't come down the way, and so there has to be a meeting of what are it's not detailed policy. What are the questions that we can easily answer to people? Say, we'll have the Scottish currency, it'll be ready for launch on the day of independence. Great. And if everybody's going on that, then we can have differences within it. With the borders, of course, we will need some borders. Of course, we'll need borders, but there's no such thing as a hard border. The functions of borders are done at different places, so we will not need anything physical at Gretna Green. And EU, what are we doing there? So we need, and those are my versions of those answers. We need to agree them in order to marry the top level coordination of and with the grassroots implementation and vibrancy that we absolutely are going to have to rely on and want to rely on, because it's our greatest strength.
Two things that have cropped up. Question here: have you spoken with the National Yes Network and Now Scotland? Are they featured in your discussions?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we'll be making an announcement very soon, as in we had a meeting last night of where we have all these groups in a room having initial conversations about how we can coordinate with each other. So absolutely, I've met great respect and enjoyable conversations, or collegiate conversations with both Now and the National Yes Network and other organising units within the campaign, and we've got more to say on that. More to say that in the next couple of days. So absolutely, because we've got this incredible parts to the organisation, and we all recognised. Iain Grant was who's part of Now, part of SIF. He's a retired consultant anaesthetist, incredibly wise man. We said, we really should start coordinating, and so we've been doing that for the last few months on a very gentle basis.
So, what involvement has the Scottish Government or the SNP had in this? In voices more generally, and within this forum that we're starting, though the SNP, just as the Greens and just as the SSP, are members of the Scottish Independence Convention, and we regularly see Keith Brown, for example, at our meetings. We've got our AGM next week, at which Mike Russell, for example, is chairing, and we will reveal then our senior SNP politics. She's now moved on from the parliamentary role, who's engaging with us. And I think that's really encouraging that we have, and maybe Mike wasn't too happy when I said this kind of elders approach to the independence movement. Those people who have been there, and particularly the SNP, for so long, that they have still a lot of respect throughout the movement. And I was really urging them that we need to get them front and centre, bring their political capital, bring their kudos with them, because we've got a pretty fractured bit of a movement. And whereas I don't
think, unfortunately, we can get everybody to hold hands with each other. We can all get close enough that we're all in the room. So and I think that's going to the key, and having people like Mike Russell, I think, is crucial to that.
That sounds really very interesting, and no doubt you'll be announcing when you're going public at some stage. Let me ask you a question about what I thought was one of the major failings of the 2014 campaign, and see if you agree, and if you do, what might be done about it. And that was that it seemed to me that we went into that referendum campaign like a golfer with one club, and that club was positivity. Everything we did and said was positive. The opposition, by contrast, had a full stack of clubs. They had one or two positives, but lots of negatives. And it seems to me, based on watching campaigns here and other countries, in particular in the US, that you have to have a good set of negative clubs. Otherwise, frankly, you just get overtaken by the system, particularly if you don't control mass media or you don't have any influence over the regulation or oversight of mass media, and they're able to pick and choose. Then the old cliche applies here, which is news is what somebody somewhere doesn't want to see in print. Anything else is advertising. So it seems to me, so the question is, will there be negative material, if I can use that loose term, and if there will be, what sort of form might that take?
So I think it's a really, really important point you've made there. I mean, so fairly recently, after a long to slow academic review process, published something with on hope versus fear in a referendum timescale. And what I did with some colleagues, Nick Baines from the University of Leicester, who's Britain's foremost academic political marketer, we examined how hope works against fear, or instead of just in the lab, where there's been quite a lot of work done. How does it play out over a whole campaign? And at its fundamental level, fear is a more powerful motivator. However, it's difficult to use and it's dangerous to use. You end up kind of soiling the nest for everybody there. So we're saying that we will stay positive, but there are types of hope appeal. One of them, there's two types of hope appeal. Promotion hope appeal is a little bit utopian, about we can have everything, sweeties for everybody. Scotland will be fantastic as soon as we're independent. And they can easily be destroyed by undermining the likelihood of that occurring. But a prevention hope is where we make a clear point that there's something bad going on, and we've got the hopeful antidote to that. Mm. So rather than going negative into a fear campaign about all the bad things, all of those Twitter posts now that we see coming back up on Facebook saying about energy prices, leaving the EU, all of the things that have been debunked since, we absolutely can put some negativity there and focus, putting the spotlight into the democratic deficit that occurs. But we've got to have a positive, hopeful, alternative vision that is not too hopeful, it's not too pie, and that people go, yes, I believe that we can do that, and I believe I can be part of doing that, and that's the sort of future that I want. Because if we just go fear, then we get tainted by that fear.
Yeah, there may be a demographic at work here, i.e. that, as you pointed out earlier, people over a certain age tend to be more risk averse, and therefore they're more susceptible to fear messages, because it plays into their worldview, i.e. that it's a dangerous world out there. And I'm particularly struck by the fact there was possibly a major swing in the last week of the 2014 campaign. And I think that may have been predicated upon a whole bunch of people thinking, oh, my heart takes me this way towards yes, but I've read the messages and the warnings, and I've summed up the risk. And on balance, perhaps just marginally, I'm going to vote no, because I might get another bite at the cherry, even if I've made a mistake this time.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely spot on there. And if I go back to a description I used earlier on about the systems 1 and systems 2. There's emotional decision making and then cognitive decision making. There is a little shunt where information goes back over. So the heart can be convinced, and then slow, into the cold light of day, we start to creep back over, which is another reason why the peer-to-peer campaigning and building relationships, we didn't know where these people were who were swithering. If we connected with them over a time, we would have been able to, metaphorically or even physically put our arms around them and walk them to the station and say, no, go with your heart here, because your heart it's not some crazy lot of things that don't make it. It's just a quick assessment of information. The information it's assessed on is still absolutely valid. But we just call it emotional, and then for various reasons, where that's kind of undermined that that's a valid way of making decisions, and it's not. So I think you're absolutely. I think you described what happened, that sway, but we also now should be able to learn from that and make sure that, again, we did something, then they did something, but now we know how to respond to that. We need to keep gaming that through, rather than just dealing with campaigning as a transaction. Speak to somebody and then they wander off, or we hand them a leaflet and then they go away. We need to think about it as the campaign relationship.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. It seems to me that it's relatively straightforward to get in touch with young people, because you've got mass media, you've got all the social media, and persuading people under 55 to come to a meeting, for example, isn't hugely difficult. Perhaps the numbers that you might hope for don't turn up, but significant people will do, and will leave enthused and go out there and really push the peer-to-peer. However, once you get up to the 60s, people don't want to come out at night, particularly elderly women, and they're exposed entirely, almost sometimes exclusively, to the mass media. Yeah. So it seems to me it'll be hugely important next time round that there is some mechanism to put their arms around, collective arms around people like that who feel isolated. And naturally, when you feel isolated and you might feel threatened, you do become risk averse. It's almost inevitable. And something must be done, I suspect, to address that particular community.
So I think there's a couple of things that I would comment on that. You're spot on. First of all, COVID and our life on Zoom has fast forwarded. I don't know, Constantine, 10 years of what at the normal pace about how we've all become much more digitally native and comfortable online, well into the well past the 60s. So we've got those skills. So being able to connect with people online is possible, but also with that, those hyper-local campaigns, so when I'm saying peer-to-peer, where someone might not have a relationship or not want to have a discussion with somebody that they know, but there is still, for those elderly people, hopefully their friends and family around them, and it's the finding the appropriate person. Like, I will never persuade my dad to do anything. You'd rather burn to death than be persuaded, don't they? But my daughter, she has some sway on him. Yeah. So we're just finding how you support them around them, but importantly, realizing that we have to, and making sure that somebody is supporting those people who are doing the supporting.
Yeah, these are wise words, it seems to me. Well, we're almost out of time, Iain. Are there any last thoughts you would like to leave with the audience briefly?
Oh, I just think that we go back to the way we felt around about Brexit, and we knew that independence was inevitable. And it's still, and it absolutely is. Things are maybe difficult at the moment. There is a lack of clarity, but we have within the movement the capacity to win this. And also not only win it, but build the country that we know it can be. It's going to take some difficult work bringing us back together, but that's all possible because we share this vision and we share the values. Whatever divides us, this is stronger and it can bring us back together again. And and I think we use this time understanding that we will be successful to really do the hard preparation that maybe we haven't done in the last 5 or 6 years. So when we are ready, when the undecideds are ready to speak to us, we're ready to listen and then talk.
Yeah, well, wise words indeed. Thank you very much for that, Iain. Do stick around once we close if you can. That's it, folks. Our time is almost up. A big thank you to Iain, and a big thank you to all of you out there for joining us tonight. I do hope you've enjoyed the TNT show. As ever, we have a formidable list of guests lined up. Next week, for example, we have columnist Ruth Wishart, and she'll be with us, and I hope you're going to join us and enjoy what Ruth has to say. As always, please look out for the Constitution column in the Sunday National. You'll find it in the 7-day supplement. This week it's been written by Elliot Bulmer, whom I'm prepared to suggest to you is the country's leading constitutional expert. So perhaps make a point of reading his column this week on Sunday. And I also want, if you will indulge me, please, to plug a book. It was published this week by one of our TNT guests of a few weeks ago, David Patrick. It's called Front Page Scotland, Newspapers and the Scottish Independence Referendum. It's published by Routledge, and I hope you, if you get the chance, order a copy of David Patrick's book. Again, it's called Front Page Scotland, Newspapers and the Scottish Independence Referendum, published by Routledge. Thanks again. Really appreciate you joining us. Please join us next Wednesday. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. We see that Boris Johnson was supported in his meeting with the president by Lynn Truss, who was famously pictured in a PR exercise holding her telephone the wrong way up and speaking into the earpiece. I give you our Foreign Secretary. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us this evening. And to all of you, stay safe and take care. Good night.